Today, we're going to be doing a much bigger version of this little Baby Yoda here. I love these little guys. For my birthday this year, it felt like that this would be a perfect time to see these Star Wars Galaxy's Edge attraction. The details everywhere were really inspiring. I love when people just soak themselves into a project. It really is going to inspire this paint job that I do. We got this little guy to remind us of that day. And he always brings a smile to my face. I just love this little dude. We have printed out a brand new Baby Yoda, also known as Grogu. We're going to be removing all of the supports from the print, and then we're going to be doing some fill-in work, and then we're going to replace some of the fingers. Then we're going to be primering that, and then we're going to base coat. We're going to mix our own paints, and then we are going to paint this guy with some detailed work and making it so that when you look at him, you're just going to automatically fall in love. So right now we're going to be removing these supports, and the supports go all the way around the body. You want to be really gentle because anything you do on one side is going to affect the other side. I'm using this tool. One of them came with my printer, and I found that these are invaluable. And now we're going to apply the wood filler. You can see more detail about how to do this on my previous video for Butt Stallion, and there is going to be a link in the description. This process of putting wood filler over the print is meant to remove all of those little lines from the print. You know, it's printing out little pieces of filament, and those little pieces of filament are sitting on top of each other. The filament is round, and so when it sits on top, there's going to be these gaps here. What we're doing is we're putting wood filler over that in order to make it smooth. When you put the wood filler on, it'll look like it's smooth, or if you put it on the other direction, it'll look all lumpy and weird. So you want to really make sure that you get a feel for how you're putting it on the model with the brush. I'm going to be putting it on one way with the brush, and then I might put it on the other way with the brush. That's me testing out which way looks like it's going to put the wood filler on there more smoothly. You want to do that because it's going to save you from sanding, and sanding is a pain in the ass. There's something with this particular file. There's a couple of problems. One of them is that the fingers don't print very well. The supports that the printer shoots out are these really organic looking shapes. So what I did was I took pieces like this, I cut them down, and I made these little fingers over here. So what we're going to do is take super glue. I'm just going to fix the fingers as I go. So they're fairly easy to get to stick on there. Looking pretty good, but we need to put a little bit of wood filler just so it blends in with the original sculpt. So we're going to take some of this glue. This is pretty much like a Elmer's glue. It's a PVA. We're going to put this on with a brush, get a little bit more control here. And as you can see, I went up onto the ledge here with the wood filler just so that the white comes through. I'm going to take these pieces of cotton ball and just start laying them randomly on here to give that look of that fluffy fabric that he has around his shawl. We want this to be fairly thick because I'm going to be putting glue over this, and it'll stick it down to the model. But we're just covering, and we want to cover every fiber. But you have to really be careful that it doesn't get dry and then stick to the brush, because that's going to be a mess. Try and spread this out a little bit. Oh, it's looking pretty good. There, we've got a nice fluffy collar on him. What a cutie pie. So the last thing we're going to do tonight is spray this guy with a little bit of primer. And we're just going to do short little bursts. This is just to get the paint to stick. There, coat one done. This needs to really dry. So I would give it at least 8 hours. Do not primer it and then just immediately go into painting. You're going to ruin everything you've done. What we're going to do is we're going to paint him, and we're going to mix our own paints. All of these colors here on this little guy are hand mixed. And this color is not that easy to get. It's more of a really light green with a tinge of a teal blue. We're going to mix that color, but first we're going to tackle the bigger section first. I really want to do this section with more depth and more values to it than I did the first time. I'm going to start off with some Titan Buff. And we're using a wet palette here. I'm gonna put a little bit of this orange in here. Now with mixing a brown, basically it's the 3 primary colors make brown. So you've got yellow, you've got a blue, and then the orange here has both yellow and red in it. And since he doesn't have that much red in his coat, I can use orange because the red's already in there and the yellow's already in there. And then I'll just mix. I think we're gonna use Hansa yellow. Since I'm mixing a brown, I'm not being super careful about what spectrum the actual paint is on. I'm gonna pick up a little bit of the teal that I'm going to be putting in his face. I want a little bit of that in his coat. And then we're gonna use a little bit of this violet oxide. I really love nylon brushes for mixing. With a brush, you don't want to get it deep into this section of the brush because it can ruin the brush. So it's kind of a green brown, and that's not quite going to be what we want. So when we mix it with this Titan, you'll see that it kind of creates this light brown that really mixes well with what the coat actually looks like. So I'm getting a bigger brush because this is a fairly large model. Also, I can mix a little bit more. I like to do some mixing on the model. I'm noticing this is super dark, so especially on this gray model. So just grab a little Titan Buff. We're going to be going over him a couple of times, so this first coat is basically a base coat. Something you want to really keep in mind is to watch overworking the paint because it'll take paint off of where it should be. The other thing is that paint often looks different when it's wet than when it's dry. So we might have to wait until it dries to know whether or not what we did is going to be the right color. Now his little fur area here is a lot lighter than his coat. So we're just gonna dip it in the Titan a little bit more for this area here. You can really see the texture that we added with the cotton balls. You can really see how that's making that look more like fur once we get the paint on it. Putting the primer on this guy, man, am I happy with how his head turned out. Because if you look at the one that I did before, you can see all the little lines from the printer, but you can't see any lines on him. So all that work is paying off. We just want to avoid any large brush marks. So we're done with the first coat of his coat. And now we can move on to his green head. He is a bluish green. I'm gonna start with equal of these two. It's really bright green. So we're definitely gonna need to add some white. And it really goes green, green, green. So we're gonna have to add some blue too. I mean, just my palette looks like Yoda with the green and the brown. Since this is such a saturated color, we're going to need quite a bit of white in order to knock this down. So this is getting to be a nice light green, but it doesn't have that blue hue. The blue hue is very difficult to get to. It goes so quickly from being a green to being a heavy blue. So that in-between blue is kind of difficult to get to. You can see now it's basically a blue, but it has just a hint of green, and that's what we want. So I think we're just gonna do the rest of the mixing on the model. I'm using a smaller brush for this because there's more detailed area. It's heavily loaded, so I have to move quickly because I do not want this drying with thick amounts of paint. We're just going to cover everything we see. I'm kind of following these little divots that he has in his head. If any lines do show up, it'll kind of look like wrinkles in his head. Now this top part is starting to dry, so I'm going to have to not paint over on that anymore. It's best to just avoid overworking the paint, especially on the lower coats, because it'll show right through all the way to the end coat. And I'm saving his face until last because I have to get detailed with it and things are going to be drying while that's happening. Since this is going to be black, it's okay if it overlaps a little bit. So I'm just going to go ahead and paint around his eyes, even if it gets into where the pupil is. That's going to be a dark color, so it's best to cover the light colors first. We're just base coating these out. Don't have to get too futzy. And since this is a base coat, you want to make sure you get everywhere. Anywhere that will be seen should be covered with the color that you want it to be. So we're just doing some more base coating here. This is going to give a fairly solid look of one color of paint. Once again, you want to go in a direction that's similar to the direction of where skin would be on the model, since I'm painting skin right now. Because if I painted this way, it would look weird. Because inevitably, you're going to get a brush stroke or two on there. I'm not a robot. Hopefully. I mean, I didn't think I was making this for robots, but if my audience was all robots, that would be okay. See how smooth that's starting to look? It's going to dry even smoother. What I'm going to do is go back and forth from the coat to the face, to the coat, to the face, to the coat, to the face. This allows each layer to dry in between, and then that way I'm not like getting up and waiting for something to dry and forgetting what I'm doing and then I'm somewhere else. Oh yeah, I could go back. You want to make sure that you stay painting. Once you start painting, you just want to keep going. It's okay to go over areas that haven't quite dried, but you have to be really careful not to ding the paint. Once the paint starts to dry and it gets in that almost like a little sticky mode, if you hit it, it might peel. So we're going to let that dry, and then we're going to go back to the coat. So we'll do this coat with a little bit more saturated brown, and we'll use it as an undercoat. No pun intended. And I'm probably going to be taking this down a couple notches so that it almost comes up to blend with this color here. And when you get to areas like this, I always take my flat brush and run it at an angle there, and then that makes a nice thin line that catches the other line. And if you want to, just push the paint. That way you don't hit the green area, and that creates a nice line. So I put on my magnifying glass, and it isn't because I can't see. I did a project once on Photoshop, and something didn't look right, and I couldn't tell what it was, and it was 1 pixel. So sometimes with things as important as a face, I want to be able to see down to the pixel size so that I can get the details just right. Just doing like little dabs here and there. I'm kind of trying to pull different colors from different areas and almost mix different colors and put little dabs of slightly different colors here and there. Just adds a bit of depth to the model. And then I really love that he has this almost blue hue to him. So 1 drop is actually going to be way more than what I need, but I can't really get it out of there any less than that. So I'm going to start mixing in a little bit more blue into this green, and I think you'll start to see how it begins to bring this to life. On the back of his head, I almost want to do little blue freckles, and they're barely going to show up. You might want to move your brush around as you're doing it, so it's even more random. It's almost like blue sunspots. These are going to be kind of painted over, so they're more of a textural element than something that you really want to pop. Now we're going to be painting his ears so that they look like the sun is coming through them. This was something I attempted to do with the model over there, and I think I did an okay job. And I really want to make these ears look almost transparent. Okay, so I got out a little bit of this primary magenta because he has little ruddy cheeks, and I mixed it fairly heavily with the color that he already is. And they're like little blotches, little blushing cheeks. So I'm just putting little dots of ruddiness on both cheeks. And we're going to use this blue-green. I'm mixing a little bit of the ruddy in there, but we're just going to go over some of them. Now remember, this is going to be a different color when it dries. And this is going to blend the whole thing together. As I was painting this guy, I started to get this weird feeling of Christmas. And technically he is green-ish with a brown coat, and in order to make brown you have to have some element of red. So what I did was I added the color of his head to the color of the coat. And as you can see, it still looks like it's brown, but for some reason it does not give out as much of the Christmassy vibe. I'm kind of finding that his head is too green, so I'm through the highlights taking down the green. As you can see, this is how his cheeks came out from what we did before. It's not as drastic as it looked when we were initially doing it. So as I'm just taking down little teeny areas of it, you know, the ruddiness is a little bit too much in areas. So I'm mixing a little bit of the black that has a mattifier in it with our colors for the cloak that he has for his coat. And that's going to take down any shininess. I also use it as a kind of a wash to get into any little cracks and crevices. Also, he should be slightly dirty. One of the beautiful things about the Star Wars production team is they have something, I believe it's called the Used Universe. And I love that idea. And I think that's exactly what makes the original so dynamic, is that they basically look like everything's old and weathered. And nothing is perfect. So it really creates this reality So we need to go back and do a little bit more ruddiness on his cheeks. I also want to take down, there's very graphic looking 1, 2, 3, 4 marks on this cheek that look a little bit too symmetrical. So I want to bring those down a little bit, make those look a little more organic. So it's easier to grab him by the ears, it's easier to grab him by this fur, and then it's easier to grab him by this. If I grab him by the hands, those are the fingers that I put on with super glue. There's a chance that they might come off, and I do not want that to happen. So what you want to do is paint basically in these 3 sections. You paint one section. As it's drying, you're leaving another section available for holding while you're painting this section. And then while that dries, then you can go back to here and paint the cloak or paint the fur. We are going to start by basing out his coat a little again. So I'm just lightly grazing with the side of my brush just because I don't want to completely take down all of the wash that I did. I want some of it to show still. And although I'm not necessarily painting this with a light source in mind, because this is a bigger kind of figure, I'm kind of letting the natural light that's in the room be the light source for it. So it exists in the real world, and the lighting for it is real light, as opposed to me giving it a light source and forcing that light source. But with that said, it is a painted piece. And things like leaving this darker, it's a good idea. So I'm indicating, I'm not forcing. When I pick up paint from the palette, I start at the top because that would be where most of the light would hit at the top and kind of drape down to the bottom. So I'm kind of placing it at the top and then pulling it down. You want these things to kind of blend, so you have to make sure that as you turn it around, it's matching on the front and the back, it's matching on the sides. It's okay if some little pieces are different, but overall you just want it to kind of match itself. Now I'm going to be adding some ruddiness to his cheek again. As you can see, this is really watery. I kind of want it watery, but I have to be careful because acrylics won't stick if there's not enough pigment in them, if it's just way too watery. But if you're using it in a way like this, where you're just using little teeny touches of it, you don't really have to worry about that as much. And it's gonna look like it's really red, but yesterday we did the same thing and see how light it is. So we're gonna do little touches and then try to get it before it dries. We're gonna get the green again, and then we're gonna dab that around as well. Before this dries, get kind of a really watery green. And then you can, like the center here is gonna be the most highly pigmented. As I go out, it's less and less pigmented. So we're gonna do this over here while it's still wet. Kind of dab all around these dots. And the area of these dots that is still wet is going to pull and kind of go into the brush mark that we're creating right now. So that's how you get like light, dark pigment happening. And then he's got it around his eyes. Really watery. It's going to look super red when it goes on. And then because I'm right-handed, I start from the center and I pull towards me. And then you start from the back and pull towards the center. That way you can do this half circle without having to start all the way over here and making sure that you turn your brush in the exact right way. If you start in the center, you just have little half circles to do. I'm looking at my source photo and he does have some blue in the ridges here. If you run your brush across like that, it'll look like it didn't deposit anything. But then you deposit the pigment by touching it. It also looks a little more natural when you do that. And now that my brush is a little bit more tired, and the bristles have spread, I can do these little teeny dots that almost become freckles. Now I'm going to take a little bit of this black and a little bit of this blue. See how it spreads? So it basically paints itself. That's a way you can kind of paint it on its own, let it do the work for you. Now I'm going to use that same color, but I am going to use a tip that has a point to it because I want to really get into this area. And then I'm just going to take this pointed brush and go over this with a little bit of the black. I'm going to do just the, while I already have it mixed, I'm going to do just the smallest hint of black here, just to highlight his expressions. So right now it's all about detail, and this is what takes the longest. Let's start getting his expression going. And I really, really want to get his eyes just perfect. I'm going around the outside with this pointed brush. It's a little easier to control, and then I'm going to go back through the inside with a bigger brush. Once we get into the detail work, it's always a good idea to stabilize yourself. So I always find a place for my pinky finger to sit, and that way I stabilize myself off of the model. And it may look shaky, but because they're both shaking in the same way, they're stable to each other. So I'm also going to be taking this black and going into his neck. I just want to have a harsh shadow there. So I've taken this, it's kind of watery. The second that this hits, it's going to spread itself out exactly where I want it. So it's almost like injecting black into an area. As opposed to painting it, I'm just injecting it there. Painting, in a lot of ways, is about the pooling of pigment within water. It's also about gravity. Like right here on these, I'm using the force of gravity to pool the pigment on there. I put way more than I need, but because I'm using so much water on it, gravity pulls it back down again and it creates a shadow. And then I could come in with a little bit more pigment on my brush and put tiny lines within that shadow, but I have that shadow there to work from. There's some lines on here that I want to highlight. Sometimes it's about going with what the model already has and using that to your advantage. I just want to state how important Carrie Fisher was in this role. Two of my favorite movies are A New Hope and Aliens. And it's funny because both of those show women in a leadership role where they are fighting forces or creatures that are very scary and very formidable. But what I love about both of those movies is that there is no big deal made about it. Sure, both the women were slightly sexualized, but arguments could be made that showing a woman in her underwear, not that big of a deal. You know, rescuing a damsel in distress, it might be a little bit of an old cliche, but it was done in a new way that was inspiring. I think it's very important to show women in these roles, and I would really like more movies like this made. You can see while I'm painting the eye what it will look like with highlights in it, reflections. But this black is going to be deep, deep matte black. It's not going to have any reflection in it at all. So we're going to paint all the reflections. And the easiest way to do an eyeball or any sphere, if you're just doing it in one color, is to get a big ball, put it in the center, and then just circle around. You can make the most minor mistake on an eyeball or a face, and everyone will notice it because we are just so attuned to that kind of stuff. So for the ears, we want him to look like the sun is coming through. So I need pyrrole orange, and I love this Hansa yellow. It almost has a little bit of blue in it. So he's got a salmon color deep in his earlobe. So we want to mix to salmon. This is where we mixed our tan. I'm going to go ahead and mix these here near the tan, because even if the tan gets in there, it's okay. And we want to mix to almost a salmon, a pale salmon color, which we're getting there quickly. So he goes basically from this very vibrant salmon, because right here that I'm painting is basically translucent. How we're going to achieve that is going to be through layers. So we're gonna do that salmon there so that we can add the yellow. And because I already have some of the orange on my brush, it's gonna kind of mix. So as you can see, that kind of made a pretty quick gradient. I am loading up my brush. I've loaded it already with this orange here. And then I've put just a hint of this fairly watery red. So you can see on my brush, it's all orange except the tip has some red on it. So we're going to use that to put the red on the inner edge here and then drag it along here. And since it's fairly watery, we're going to just drag it all the way to the end, and it should turn more orange. And then I'm just going to take it down a little bit by dragging a dry brush onto it, which then pulls up some of the pigment and the water. And then you see the background color that we laid down before. So his eye is a brown. We can use this brown from the coat, and it goes around in kind of a half circle. He has fairly large pupils, and he has a fairly large iris. So that's one. Then we're going to start a little bit higher over here from this one and go around. So you can start to see his look coming together. And he always looks snotty when you first put the iris on him, but it's those highlights that are really gonna give that innocence. This eyeball I love. This one has issues. So if you find you have one eyeball that you love, then you need to work on the other one to match that one. And you really want to have him look around. Do you feel him there? Do you feel his presence? I swear I actually do that. We're going to highlight the eyes. I'm going to start over here. I have my brush loaded. I just want to highlight that edge. So this is very fidgety work. And I'm not using a white. I'm using a brownish tan, because a white here would just be way too bright. You have to really make sure you steady your hands and keep control of your brush. I'm just holding my brush up and kind of finding where I think it would look good on the eye. One up here, kind of over to the side. And then one over here that's very, very faint. It's so faint. There. And then we'll do that for him over here. That's our little intergalactic star child for sure. What we're going to do next is something pretty fun. I'm going to use a satin glazing liquid, and we're going to put fuzz on his hair. We're going to take a very small amount of this glazing liquid, and I'm going to very lightly put a couple of little dots here. And then here and here and here. This is a cotton ball. It's a pure cotton ball, and I'm just going to take a little bit and then just dab it on his head. And I almost just take it. We're just getting like one hair at a time, really. So I'm going to take a little piece of the cotton and I sort of hold it with the end of the brush. I'm just trying to get like 1 or 2 hairs at a time. I mean, it's just fuzz. Whew, he's got little baby hairs. And you gotta make sure they stick. That's why I kind of pull them as I'm laying them down. You know, even though I've just put a little bit there, the effect is happening. But this is the finishing touch. That's the last little bit of what makes him him. And once this dries, I think we got our guy. Isn't he cute? Well, I really hope that I've inspired you to get out your paintbrushes and start painting. Just get stuck into a project and relax while making something for yourself or for somebody that you know. Since this pandemic has hit, I have been a little bit lost with some of the things that I normally do. They've all been gone, but there's one thing that I can fall back on, and it's something that I've been doing since I was very young. I haven't been painting though for quite some time. I have not done it with the fervor that I've been doing it lately, and I am so glad that I have. So maybe there's an old love that you have. It can be creating anything. There's so many ways you can take creativity. So get out there and make something.